Welcome back to the ABC, the Arctic and Alaskan Broadcasting Channel. Today we will be covering the impact of melting sea ice on polar bears. Melting sea ice is when frozen seawater is melted by warmer temperature from climate change, which causes it to turn into seawater. According to our public survey with 55 responses, 70% of people know little to nothing about the roles of polar bears in the ecosystem. This is important because if people don't understand how polar bears impact the ecosystem, they may be less likely to support the efforts to protect them. Let's learn more about the impacts of sea ice melting on polar bears with our expert, Anthony.
Thank you, Aaron. As said before, we are talking about polar bears suffering from melting sea ice in the Arctic. According to scied.ucar, in the Canada Hudson Bay, there is a 22% decrease in the polar bear population. The melting sea ice in the Arctic also impacts the reproduction rates / life cycle of the polar bears. With less sea ice, polar bears cannot hunt for food as often because the sea ice is their main hunting ground, so they wind up with less food to eat. This impacts their life cycle and reproduction, as without food they may die quicker and not be able to reproduce. Explained by WWF.org, a change to the polar bear population can lead to an increase in the seal population. This is because seals are the main form of food for polar bears. Without polar bears, seal populations will increase due to the lack of predators. According to National Geographic, another population that will change are the Arctic foxes. This is because they rely on the scraps and leftovers polar bears leave after hunting seals. Less polar bears means less dead seals for foxes to scavenge, which results in Arctic foxes struggling to survive and reproduce, leading to a decrease in population. Polar bears will most likely die out of the migration and adaptation choices because of melting sea ice. From 2011 to 2021, the Arctic lost about 770,000 miles of sea ice. That's a huge amount, and it's a big problem for animals like polar bears who depend on ice to hunt and move around. They cannot migrate as they need a cold environment and sea ice to survive, and they cannot adapt as they reproduce every 3 years and could take millions of years for them to adapt. A 2020 study from Earth.org predicted that if things don't change, polar bears could go extinct by the year 2100. Let's learn more about the effects on ecosystems and abiotic factors.
Thank you, Anthony, for that beautiful report. Sea ice is melting so quickly. According to oceantoday.noaa.gov, almost 50% of its ocean coverage has melted since 2000. An abiotic factor that is impacted is the sea temperature. There is an increase of almost 1.1 degrees per decade. This is because sea ice plays a crucial role in reflecting the solar energy from the sun back into the environment. An ecosystem service that has been impacted by the loss of sea ice is the prevention of erosion. Sea ice originally used to surround the coast in the Arctic as well as Alaska. It had a very important role because it shielded the coastlines from the ocean waves. Now that almost 50% of the coverage is gone, ocean waves are crashing into the coastline and causing increased erosion along the coast. I predict that in 50 years, due to the increase of temperature per decade, the average temperature in Alaska could reach almost 80 degrees Fahrenheit.
Here are some interviews with the public about how the Arctic is being affected by climate change and how the polar bears are being affected.
Today we're going to be interviewing my sister about some questions about polar bears. So, what do you know about climate change in the Arctic?
I know that climate change and global warming have both been really big problems for a really long time in the Arctic, and it has been accelerating every year.
And what do you know about, or how do polar bears contribute to the environment in the Arctic?
Because they are at the top of the food chain, they are in charge of regulating population for seals and other prey that they are in charge of.
How is the melting sea ice, which is caused by climate change, affecting the polar bears?
It is depleting their natural habitat.
And kind of backing off of number 2, how will the loss of polar bears affect the Arctic ecosystem?
Like I said, because they are in charge of overpopulation of different prey, they run the risk of overpopulating the area and throwing the food chain off balance.
And what are some ways you think you can help prevent the melting of ice?
One way is to remember to recycle and sort out your trash.
Alright, question 1. What do you know about climate change in the Arctic region?
I would assume that the ice is melting because of climate change, which is not good.
Okay, question 2. How do polar bears contribute to the environment in the Arctic?
They're part of the ecosystem, so I don't know beyond that.
Okay, question 3. How is the melting sea ice caused by climate change affecting the polar bears?
It probably affects their food supply.
Okay. Question 4. How will the loss of polar bears affect the Arctic ecosystem?
It it's a symbiosis relationship with all the creatures in the Arctic. So if one's affected, it affects them all.
Okay. Question 5. What are some ways you think you can help prevent the melting of ice?
By reducing your carbon footprint, which could be a lot of different things.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you for those interviews. Now let's have Matteo talk.
Thank you, Aaron. As we can see, Norway's coastal towns are greatly suffering from the impacts of rising sea levels due to melting ice in the Arctic. Norway has placed many climate change policies to slow down the melting of their local ice. As stated by The Guardian, Norway has committed to net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. And this country also imposes a carbon tax, which taxes emissions from petroleum activities such as mining for coal and oil. Norway is also part of the Arctic Council, which is an organization of Arctic nations that addresses climate change in the Arctic. According to IEA.org, Norway is working to decrease their carbon emissions by 55% in 2030. If Norway can meet its goals, then it will decrease the amount of greenhouse gases, which will slow down the rate of global warming. This in turn will slow the rate of melting ice down, and accordingly the polar bears will greatly benefit from this, because their habitats will not be melting at such a fast rate. Polar bears will have a decrease in habitat loss and breeding grounds, and decreasing in their declining population rate. When the polar bear population increases, the balance of controlled prey populations will also be restored. If the polar bears do go extinct, then the herbivore prey populations will overwhelm the environment's plant life factor, and because the polar bears will not be able to eat and control their herbivore population.
Thank you, Matteo. As sea level continues to rise, coastal erosion become more severe, forcing native and local population to relocate inland due to increased flooding risk. This change has already affected communities. For example, according to the 2003 U.S. government report analyzed by the newamerica.org, 86 of indigenous villages in Alaska are already experiencing the harmful effect of sea level rise and melting ice. This impact is significant as coastal ecosystems degrade. The ecosystem service of erosion prevention is more reduced. Sea ice acts as a barrier for erosion as ice blocks big waves from hitting the coast. People living along the coast are forced to abandon their communities and search for safer, higher ground. If sea level continues to rise, erosion will worsen and more people will be displaced. Scientists predict that global sea level would rise up to 1 meter by 2100, which would endanger millions living in low-lying areas. Over the next 50 years, this ongoing phenomenon is expected to push entire coastal population further inland and increase pressure on inland resource and ecosystems.
Thanks for tuning in to ABC News. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay positive. I'll see you in our next episode.